Retired now from both the British Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, the Buccaneer holds the title of the last wholly British-made bomber. In service till the 1990s, this aircraft has a long history that traces its way back to the early Cold War, when the Royal Navy was threatened by an advanced Soviet warship. The Buccaneer would later inherit the role of another legend in British aviation, the English Electric Canberra, a very hard act to follow. In 1952, one of the Royal Navy's biggest problems came in the form of new Soviet cruisers, including those of the Sverdlov-class. These speedy pocket battleships could potentially ferry lethal nuclear weapons to the doorstep of Britain. A question foremost in the minds of Royal Navy leadership was how to counter a sea flooded with these floating nuclear platforms. The Royal Navy looked to the lessons of the past to forge a solution. World War II had proven that a large navy could effectively be neutralized by a relatively small number of the right aircraft. At the Battle of Taranto, in November of 1941, Swordfish torpedo bombers were able to devastate the Italian Navy in a deadly night strike. A month later, the Imperial Japanese Navy followed suit with an aerial assault against the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The British Fleet Air Arm was looking for a high-speed, low-flying attack bomber that could similarly counter any Soviet Sverdlov threat.
We were concerned about the maritime threat, and the Sverdlov came out as like a German pocket battleship. So we had to come up with a solution to that, and they thought instead of building another capital ship, which were tending to go out of fashion, the Buccaneer would be the answer, in that it could attack the ship at low level under the radar lobe.
In August of 1952, the Ministry of Supply asked for submissions for a two-seat carrier-based aircraft, capable of flying at well over 600 miles an hour and down to 200 feet above sea level. Also, if required, this same aircraft was able to carry an atomic bomb. The Royal Navy was joining the nuclear club.
Initially, the idea was you would take it out with a small nuclear weapon. So the Buccaneer would be up to 580 knots. Typically in the attack it's more like 550 knots. But it'd be running in at 100 feet and then lobbing the nuclear weapon at the Sverdlov. Inherently, quite an inaccurate attack, but you used a huge weapon to take out the threat.
Blackburn Aircraft was one contender for the contract to build the Royal Navy's bomber. The company had a long tradition in making naval aircraft, but some of their earlier designs had not been particularly successful.
Blackburn, perhaps a bit unlucky firm. They had some aircraft designs, for example in the Second World War, which really were not very good at all for one reason or another. They had an aeroplane called the Firebrand, which was a very difficult development program.
Regardless of these earlier failures, Blackburn persevered and won a contract by submitting a proposal for a potent new bomber. The company continued to develop their advanced aircraft, then simply named the NA-39, under the utmost secrecy. And in April of 1958, the prototype was finally airborne.
Nearly everyone who flew the Buccaneer had various nicknames for it, probably unrepeatable over here, but Brick and Something and House sort of springs to mind. But enabled the aircraft to fly very fast at low level. Not many aircraft could stay in low level turbulence at the sort of speeds that the Buccaneer could achieve, and therefore it made it difficult for the opposition to get a handle on you.
While the Royal Navy was searching for an answer to the Soviet nuclear-armed vessels, the Royal Air Force was looking for a new strike and reconnaissance aircraft. In November 1956, more than 2 years before the NA-39's maiden flight, General Operating Requirement 339 was issued to the aircraft industry for a replacement of the RAF's Canberra. Though the Canberra was an excellent tactical bomber and reconnaissance aircraft, the RAF needed to look forward and keep one step ahead of Soviet technology. The issue of Requirement 339 was followed closely by the release of Duncan Sandy's Defense White Paper, foretelling the demise of expensive fighter aircraft in what was said to be the missile age. Military budgets were under tight scrutiny, and there was a suggestion that a more advanced version of the Navy's NA-39 might fulfill the RAF's needs.
The Buccaneer was Navy design, which really wasn't that popular with the RAF, possibly because, of course, it was a Navy aircraft. And if you look in the National Archives at Kew, the British National Archives, you will find that several times the RAF or the Air Staff, the Air Ministry, looked at versions of the Buccaneer for the RAF through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, and regularly rejected it for all manner of reasons. But as I say, I'm sure the fact it was a Navy aircraft in part was the problem.
Certainly the Air Force decided that the Buccaneer was a bit behind the times for them electronically. This is probably true, and they wanted the much vaunted and promised TSR-2.
For its time, the TSR-2 was one of the most sophisticated aircraft available anywhere. It was the product of two companies, English Electric and Vickers, who later came together to form BAC. In June 1958, despite strong objections from the Treasury and the Navy, the RAF was told it could have the TSR-2. This only days after the NA-39, now known as the Buccaneer, made its first flight. The TSR-2 was just about everything the RAF was looking for. It was a fast, low-level, computerized aircraft with the ability to avoid Soviet defenses and deliver nuclear strikes against high-value targets. However, after 7 years of development, it also became increasingly expensive, and too much so for the new Labour government of 1965. With 10 pre-production models all but finished, and just one actually flying, the project was cancelled.
TSR-2 became a very complex and a very expensive aeroplane. When it started life in the late 50s as a Canberra replacement, it was really looked on as more of a bomber capable of supersonic dash over the target, maybe Mach 1.4, with not a particularly great range. But as it became the only surviving combat aircraft program in this country following the 1957 White Paper, where manned fighter aircraft were officially going to be dispensed with in due course, really it grew in size, and it grew in complexity, and also the requirements went up and up. I think it reached 1,000 miles at 1,000 miles an hour. It was a very complex requirement. That actually made the aircraft far more expensive, just having that capability.
Without the TSR-2, the RAF needed a stopgap solution for a new strike aircraft. Prime Minister Wilson looked to America to help re-equip the RAF. At first, the General Dynamics swing-wing F-111 was considered, and in February 1967, 50 RAF versions were ordered. Like the TSR-2, the F-111 could fly low, avoid Soviet radar, and carry nuclear weapons into the heart of the Soviet Union. Its swing wings and advanced terrain-following radar gave it the ability to fly at treetop level. Although the 111s ultimately went into series production and became workhorse bombers of the USAF and Royal Australian Air Force, at that time they suffered a similar cost overrun as the TSR-2, and the RAF order was cancelled. Now the RAF was left with few places to shop, and still a considerable need to fill. The multi-role combat aircraft, the Tornado, was in the works, but it was years away from its first flight. By 1968, a decade after the TSR-2 was ordered, the Royal Air Force had come to realize that the best available option at that time was the Buccaneer, then produced by BAC.
The American F-111, but that proved too expensive, so the Air Force was then left having to make a last-minute decision, and lo and behold, they came up with the trusty Buccaneer, the aircraft they could have had for all those years.
The Buccaneer was finally installed in both services, but not for too long. Government cutbacks continued, resulting in the phasing out of all conventional carrier-borne aircraft in 1978. Soon the Royal Navy would have to rely exclusively on jump jet technology alone. pocket Soviet cruisers, which created the original need for a Buccaneer, never became a serious threat. The type was just too vulnerable to Western maritime missiles. All of the Navy's complement of Buccaneers were transferred to the RAF, where they and their purpose-built Air Force counterparts remained in service until March of 1994.
Production went on into the 1970s, and incredibly this stopgap aeroplane, because it was so advanced, so capable, actually stayed in RAF service right through until 1993, which is quite an incredible achievement, I think. Very, very superb aeroplane, the Buccaneer.
The Royal Air Force, I think they became great fans of it. During the Tornado's development, they used the Buccaneer as a development vehicle for the Tornado avionics. And my intelligence tells me that they thought that in the ground attack role, Buccaneer equipped with the Tornado weapon system was actually a better aircraft than the Tornado.
On the 17th of August 1966, the only prototype to have flown of Britain's most advanced aircraft project was towed down this road. It flew just 24 times, and the £200 million that had been spent on its research and development was eventually to be reduced to just £50,000 worth of scrap. This is an aircraft graveyard at Shoebury-Ness in Essex, where once proud aeroplanes are used as targets to test the effects of gunfire and shrapnel. Such was the fate of TSR-2. What remains today of the TSR-2 project can only be found in museums, standing as testimony to the decisions that sealed its fate. Conceived in the 1950s, designed and flown in the early 60s, the story of TSR-2 is one of technological triumph and human endeavor. It was an aircraft years ahead of its time. The years 1950 to 1957 could be described as the post-war golden age of the British aircraft industry. Shop floors were full of priority orders, resulting from the Korean War panic. Design officers were working flat out on a whole series of advanced operational requirements for the RAF and the Navy. The Farnborough air shows revealed a procession of advanced prototypes and piloted scale models of shapes to come. Then, in 1957, the Secretary of State for Defence, Duncan Sands, presented his Defence White Paper to Parliament, which called for the elimination of manned aircraft in favour of missile systems. This left Britain's aircraft industry and the Royal Air Force with just one key project to pursue: the replacement of the highly successful and widely exported Canberra bomber.
On the sort of aircraft we were looking at, we'd already looked at the idea of a specialized low-level bomber, and that was cancelled in early 56, I think for quite good reasons, as it was such a narrow role for an aircraft. And we felt we still should go for low-level because we saw it as the only means of penetrating Soviet air defenses. But equally, we wanted it to be able to put on a reasonable performance at altitude. And I'm talking anywhere between 40 and 60,000 feet. I say that because we visualize air operated engines, ordinary turbojets, in other words. We weren't thinking of things like ramjets or anything. And we called it tactical strike reconnaissance aircraft, hoping that that would convey the idea of our operational technique.
Meanwhile, the Royal Navy had not been idle in identifying its requirement for a low-flying strike aircraft. In 1955, Blackburn Aircraft won the contract to develop the NA-39 Buccaneer, a twin-seat carrier-borne strike aircraft capable of flying under the enemy's surface vessel radar screen. The Navy had a powerful ally in Lord Louis Mountbatten, who, as Chief of the Defence Staff and a lifelong naval officer, tried to persuade the RAF to opt for a modified version of the Buccaneer as the Canberra replacement. Whilst this would have helped to reduce the costs for the Navy and ultimately the Air Force, the RAF felt that the Buccaneer would not fulfill their requirements.
Now, the Buccaneer was an extraordinarily successful airplane. It was built mainly for low-level work. But the point was that the RAF didn't think it was, at that stage, was fast enough or good enough high up. There was nothing wrong with the Buccaneer. And contrary to the popular belief, and you may be very interested to hear this, that in 1956, I asked Barry Late, who was then the chief designer of Blackburn's, if he would very kindly produce a brochure for me on the NA-39 for the Royal Air Force. And he did that, and we did consider it. It was very seriously considered. Mountbatten used to rather lie about that and say we never took any interest, but it was very seriously considered by the Air Force.
Now, I think the real tragedy is that the Tories should have had the sense to develop the Buccaneer into a strike reconnaissance aircraft for the Air Force, but the Air Force wouldn't agree to that. And Varel Begg later told me that he thought that the decision to go for the TSR-2 was, in a sense, compensation to the Air Force for the government's decision to give the nuclear deterrent to the Navy. And Varel Begg was head of the Navy.
By March 1957, the RAF began to circulate its basic requirement under the title General Operational Requirement 339. The industry were to report back with designs and comments by January 1958. But in September 1957, the government dropped another bombshell on the industry. At Chelmex's house, the permanent secretary at the Ministry of Supply called a meeting of the heads of all the major aircraft companies and told them that following the 57 Defence White Paper, there was no certainty of further aircraft projects except GOR 339. He also told them that proposals would only be accepted from those firms who were prepared to collaborate together on the project. The government had effectively aimed a pistol at the industry's head. The message was amalgamate or die. The companies spent hundreds of thousands of man-hours developing their concepts. Amongst them, Vickers Armstrong, who came up with a single and twin-engine version of their Type 571, which was to be based on the new concept of a fully integrated airframe, engine, equipment and weapons system. English Electric was the only British company to have built an operational supersonic aircraft in the Lightning. They proposed their P-17 provided with a VTOL capability by the P-17D from Shorts, who'd been gaining valuable experience in vertical takeoff with their SC-1.
The P-17 concept was a very, very good one, and if you look at the general arrangement drawings of it, superimposed on a picture of the TSR-2, you'll find that outwardly there's very little difference.
The P-17 was to ride piggyback on the P-17D to give it a full vertical takeoff capability. The P-17D, which was powered by no fewer than 70 engines, was to enable the P-17 to take off and land back on the platform in the air.
English Electric had got the measure of the supersonic bomber aspect absolutely right, but their solution to providing the short field takeoff and landing capability with this lifting platform, I think would have been immensely difficult to do, very costly, and I had some doubts as to its practicability. I didn't think it would work.
The P-17D was dropped after the RAF redefined their requirement as OR-343, based solely on the Vickers English Electric submissions. Initially, the enforced amalgamation of the two companies was not welcomed.
Well, frankly, we thought it was absolutely wrong. We thought it was a misjudgment which would lead to cost overrun, delays, unnecessarily complications in working out this very complex design, which could much more easily have been done by one firm as a main contractor. And if that one firm didn't have the total manufacturing capacity to cope with the whole program, then they should have subcontracted it out to the other parts of the industry that could take it on.
English Electric had already 10 years' experience in building supersonic military aircraft. No other firm in this country had. They had the Canberra behind them, and they had a design known as the P-17, which was very close indeed to the specification which was put down subsequently for TSR-2. Nevertheless, the prime contract was given to Vickers. It's true to say that their experience lay in subsonic aircraft and in civil aircraft. The only military plane, I think, that they built was the Valiant bomber, which had manifest structural faults in design and was in fact withdrawn after 5 years, so you could say it was a failure. And yet, in spite of the contrast between the two firms' experience and capability, they were told to amalgamate, and the prime contract was given to Vickers. I think it was mistaken.
English Electric were regarded by the rest of the industry as newcomers. The great names, Hawkers, de Havillands, Vickers, Bristols, had been companies existing to way back to World War I and even earlier. English Electric, the name English Electric only came into the general public view after World War II. They had built very successfully a range of Hampden and Halifax bombers under license from Handley Page during the war. And then on the basis of that, a new design team was formed in 1945, specifically to design and build for the RAF its first jet bomber, the Canberra. English Electric were regarded as newcomers by the rest of industry, and I think slightly resented for that.
By any standards at that time, TSR-2 was to be the most advanced aircraft in the world. It was to be capable of around Mach 1.1 at 200 feet and Mach 2 at medium and high altitudes with a radius of action of 1,000 nautical miles. The aircraft would need a completely new, fully automatic radar system, more advanced than anything else in existence, including terrain following and sideways-looking radar with automatic updating of data. It was to be capable of taking a full reconnaissance fit, operate from short strips in all weather, and provide everything from long-range nuclear strike to battlefield support. No self-defense weapons were initially proposed, although there was a provision to carry 4 air-to-surface rockets. The government's choice of the Bristol Siddeley Olympus engine was a controversial decision and was to lead to delays and massive cost overruns.
We were strongly in favour of a Rolls-Royce engine. not least because we considered that the Bristol Olympus development wasn't far ahead, and that we would end up with in the classic situation which should be avoided in aircraft development. That's a new design of aeroplane with a new design of engine right from flight one. That complicates the issues. Wherever you can, you should combine a new aeroplane with a well-proven engine.
Rolls-Royce at that day, they didn't want all these aircraft to succeed with Bristol engines. And this was before Rolls-Royce bought up Bristol. The TSR-2 was going to have the Bristol Olympus. The 1154 was going to have a form of the Bristol Pegasus. And this really didn't suit Rolls-Royce at all at the time.
Undoubtedly, the development costs of the Olympus were a big factor in the escalating costs of the program, but much worse than that, in my view, was the unreliability of the engine. We did actually, to use the phrase I have just used, arrive at a classic situation where we had a brand new untried aeroplane with an engine which was not only unproved, it hadn't passed its airworthiness type tests, but it actually had a known catastrophic failure on it, which put the TSR-2 prototype at risk when we started flying.
Problems with the engine would prove difficult to resolve and were not identified until after the first flight. The Vulcan Olympus flying testbed would later blow up whilst taxiing. The government placed the contract for 9 pre-production aircraft with the Vickers English Electric Consortium in October 1960, more than 18 months after the contract had first been announced. In spite of mounting opposition from the Navy and the Treasury, Britain's most ambitious aircraft project yet devised had been given the go-ahead. Vickers, under Sir George Edwards, was to be the prime contractor and responsible for the front fuselage section, which included the cockpit, weapon systems, and budget control. English Electric, led by its chief designer, Freddie Page, was to concentrate on the aerodynamics, wings, tail, and rear fuselage. From an early stage, the consortium responded to the project's critics in Whitehall by illustrating their design philosophy, as seen in this film extract presented by their chief project engineer, Ollie Heath.
With a tailplane so designed as to release the whole of the wing for flat blowing, the provision of adequate thrust-to-weight ratio secured by powerful Olympus 22R engines giving a thrust-to-weight ratio of 0.6, the requirement for rudimentary field operation by large wheels, which despite the requirements for low cross-sectional area are stowed within the aeroplane without drag penalty, the crosswind requirements met by the large parachute, which of course also confers the short landing facility.
The advanced technology of the aircraft was mirrored in the complexity of the manufacturing, which was to employ new working practices and advanced materials. Other problems relating to project management control would lead to delays.
One of the most delaying aspects of the program was that many of the subcontractors were working directly with the ministry and not under the control of the central management organization, that is BAC. And this led to complications, misunderstandings, and inevitable delays. I remember one famous occasion when one of the committees that I attended of industry and the ministry officials and civil servants from the establishments and elsewhere. The chairman took a look round the room when we started in St Giles Court, long room, full of cigarette smoke and battered cups of tea. And He took a look round the room. He said, "I want a count taken." And there was a head count taken at this meeting, and there were 58 people in the room. And the chairman quite reasonably said, "This is quite ridiculous. Nobody could control a program with meetings this size. I want you all to go away, and the next meeting is convened for such and such a date, and I want to see a significant reduction in the numbers at that meeting." And in due course, we all came back to the reconvened meeting, and there were 61 in the room.
The ministry, for instance, annexed control of the cockpit layout, I think arbitrarily at some point. And there was a civil servant in the ministry who was in charge, and I quote, "as far as the government was concerned." But there are a lot more to it than that. I think the contractor had a seat on his committee, but that didn't represent control either.
In my own experience, we had cockpit committee meetings which spent days not only just trying to decide where one particular switch should go, but what the caption should be under the switch. And then they decided, against the advice of the operators, in that case me, to put a caption under a vital switch, which made no sense to the aircrew at all, and eventually, before we flew, it had to be changed. And this is a typical example of the very simple, silly delays that occurred in the program.
In the United States, the advanced technology and potential of TSR-2 had been a source of concern, and progress of the project had been closely monitored.
They sent a team over from the Pentagon in 1960 under an official called Cortlandt Perkins, and they went all over the TSR-2 building. They expressed enormous enthusiasm. They let the British Aircraft Corporation, they let them understand that they would be interested in purchasing. They were nothing of the kind. They were interested in finding out what was going on, in order to adapt it into their own version, which came much later and much less successfully, the F-111. Now, I don't blame the Americans.
Well, I think it's become very clear since those days that the Americans were primarily very worried about the emergence of TSR-2 because they saw it as a direct challenge to the military air supremacy that they were aiming to establish with their F-111 swing-wing low-level attack aeroplane, which was designed for a very similar role to TSR-2.
Early in 1960, American industry was asked what at the time seemed impossible. It was asked to design an airplane that would fly faster at any altitude than any existing fighter.
It was behind it in time. It ran into enormous technical problems, and it overran its cost predictions very, very greatly. But we know that the Americans thought that the TSR-2 was a threat, that if we had been as successful with TSR-2 as we had been with its predecessor, the Canberra, which was so good, if you remember, that the Americans themselves bought the Canberra, I think they saw the TSR as a threat to their potential worldwide interest in exporting military airplanes, and they were very anxious to get rid of it.
The Australians, who had also purchased the Canberra bomber, found themselves in a similar position to the RAF in looking for a suitable replacement.
I think the Australians needed to replace their Canberras, and therefore, as they usually did, they looked at Britain and said, "What are you doing? You must be replacing yours."
I made 2 visits to Canberra with teams from British Aerospace to make presentations on the TSR-2 program, during which we understand that they were planning to acquire 30 airframes. Royal Air Force was planning to have 150, and this 30 would have made a nice addition to and made the production run really stable. During the early part of 1964 was the year in which the aeroplane first flew. We understood that the Australian government had virtually signed up for a contract for TSR-2.
After more than 5 years' work, the first prototype, XR-219, was transported in sections to the Aircraft and Armament Experimental Establishment at Boscombe Down in Wiltshire, where it would take 3 months to assemble. The choice of Boscombe Down as the site of the flight test program was a compromise solution. English Electric's base at Warton in Lancashire would have been an ideal support and maintenance base. Vickers had wanted the first flight to take place from their airfield at Wisley. Roland Beaumont argued that the Wisley runway was too short. Working from Boscombe Down would create more problems.
Nobody really wanted us there, or they did their very best to help us, I must say. We didn't want to be there. We had the worst of both communication worlds. We were 150 miles from Warton and 60 miles from Weybridge, where we ought to have been doing all that work on one base with all the experts just round the block.
The sum total of delays and resultant cost increases that were plaguing the project meant the planned in-service date had to be put back. This news poured further fuel on the fire of mounting opposition from the project's critics. Mountbatten, perhaps TSR-2's most determined critic, was still pushing hard for the Buccaneer. He visited Australia and met their Defence Minister, Sir Frederick Sherger.
He said that it would, he went round the place saying that it was absolutely what the Air Force wanted, and everybody knew this, and he used to go around with a briefcase with one model of the TSR-2 and 5 of the Buccaneers and put them on the table in front of people like Sherger in Australia and say, you can have 5 of these for 1 of those, so why do you bother?
Mountbatten, to the best of my knowledge, told them they wouldn't be coming into service, or certainly poured cold water on it.
The Australians listened to this, and by the time we started flying in August, we had been given to understand that the Australians were almost certainly shifting and going for the F-111.
I'm sure they would have bought the TSR-2 had it gone ahead.
The newly assembled and freshly painted TSR-2 was wheeled out in September 1964 to commence its engine runs and taxi trials. Roland Beaumont and other members of his flight test team still had nagging concerns about the unresolved engine and undercarriage problems. The continuing build-up of political pressure and adverse media criticism was heightened by the looming general election, with the ruling Conservative government looking set to lose. Meanwhile, a meeting was convened at Boscombe Down. In view of the October election and the Labour Party's uncertain support for the project, the question on everybody's lips was, when could TSR-2 make its first flight? A successful flight before the election might prove critical to the project's survival. The chief project test pilot was faced with a very difficult decision. He was well aware of the dangers of an engine failure and of the consequences of cancellation.
Don Bowen, my observer, backseater, and I were the people on whom the total responsibility of this enormous pyramidal organization were going to fall, on Flight 1. But it wasn't a sudden precipice to go over. We'd been doing taxi trials on the aeroplane, testing all its systems out on the ground. We'd taxied it up to takeoff speed, tested the parachute, the brakes and all the rest of it. By the time we were ready to fly on that day, I had any doubts about the capability of the aeroplane had long since gone. I was very confident that it was going to fly well. It's an extraordinarily good moment when you turn onto the runway, you call for clearance to go, you get clearance from the tower, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, brakes off. You light the reheat and go, and from then on, you know exactly what it's supposed to do, and your task is just to be totally alert to see if it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It's a fascinating moment. It's professionally enormously satisfying. And then when you come airborne and you find this new device actually performs as well as predicted, or even in the case of TSR-2 better, we scheduled to fly the TSR-2 first flight for 30 minutes. We in fact flew for 27 minutes. Halfway through that, at the end of the first circuit round Boston, I had formed the opinion that this was far more than a questionable aeroplane. This was a brilliant first attempt at getting this complex aeroplane right. It was so good and so right on Flight 1 after 10 minutes that I was enjoying the sensation of just relaxing and feeling this is a marvelous aeroplane. I felt I'd been there before.
The first flight had demonstrated the potential of the aircraft, but for technical reasons it was not to fly again until the very last day of the year. In the meantime, there'd been a change of government. On the 16th of October, the results of the polls confirmed the predicted Labour win. Out went the Tories, and with them went government backing for TSR-2. The fate of TSR-2 was now in the hands of the new Labour administration.
I'm certain they were evasive. And I looked at the Labour Party manifesto to see whether it said anything about it just the other day. And it's pretty uninformative. Attacked the government, of course, for the way in which the aviation industry had been handled in the previous 10, 13 years. That's standard stuff. But it didn't contain any real commitment to the TSR-2 in particular. And I think in Preston there was some promise put about in the campaign there that TSR-2 will be safe under Labour, but I don't think there was any other indication that they were committed to it, and they were, as I say, I think pretty evasive.
Yes, well, we ran into a number of unexpected problems at Boston Down. First of all, it was planned that I should fly it for the first 4 or 5 flights until I was satisfied with its handling qualities, because you have continuity of experience. The more you fly a new type of airplane, obviously the safer the flying becomes because you're on a learning curve. On Flight 2, we had a very severe vibration problem. We had it again on Flight 3. These were engine-associated problems, or engine system-associated problems. And then on Flight 5, we had a major undercarriage malfunction, which could have lost us the prototype. It was actually an abandoned aircraft case had we chosen to take that road. But in consultation with Don Bowen in the back, I said, "Okay, Don, here's your opportunity to try out Martin Baker." That was the ejection seat. And he said, "What are you going to do, B?" And I said, "I think I'm going to try and land it." And there was a long pause from the back, and he said, "You're not going to get rid of me that easily, I'm staying." And so we landed it with the undercarriage in the wrong place. There are a number of problems with the undercarriage. The first one we encountered was sequencing. The undercarriage was not carrying out the correct sequencing in raising and lowering, and that took some time to get right. The next one was that it was what's known as a long stroke undercarriage to absorb this great shock. This, in fact, resulted in it being quite flexible fore and aft. And from the first landing onwards, we found when we touched down with this aeroplane, the undercarriage literally twanged. It swung back as we touched the ground. It caused vibrations to run right through the airframe and to reach the crew area, the cockpit in the nose of the airplane, as a very powerful lateral oscillation. You had an oscillation which was about the same rate as the natural frequency of the human eyeball. So that at the moment you touched down, you stopped being able to see the runway for a fraction of a second.
The very nature of test flying will invariably throw up the occasional dramatic moment.
That was a one-off. It was a pilot on his first flight on the airplane. He hadn't quite understood the dynamics of the airplane, and he'd got his approach slightly wrong, and he touched down at a very high rate of descent. When we got to Flight 20, I think it was, up at Warton, we were clear of all the minor snags on the airplane, and we thought now's the time to get on to curing this or investigating this undercarriage problem. The first thing to do was to measure the difference between touching down on a dry runway and touching down on a very reduced coefficient of friction runway, low mu. That was obtained by getting the fire brigade to spread foam on the runway, and Jimmy Dale touched down on the foam with the onboard vibration sensors measuring the vibration set up at that point, and they were then directly compared with the similar vibrations caused on touching down on a dry runway. That was all part of the research to get that one right. It became apparent that the next and vital stage of the flight development of the airplane was going to need expertise, knowledge and facilities which didn't exist at the Weybridge end of the consortium. They existed in large measure at Warton, and this type of aeroplane was right within Warton's expertise. So it gradually became apparent in the management of the program that thinking changed towards moving the first prototype and the subsequent flight development, which was going to be at least 3 years and 3,500 hours of testing in toto up to Warton under the charge of Freddie Page, who was the chief designer.
Flight 14 was not simply a return home. Roland Beaumont, having satisfied himself that the aircraft was performing as planned, took TSR-2 supersonic for the first and only time. Engaging reheat on just one engine, the acceleration was such that he left Jimmy Dell behind, even though he had engaged full reheat on both Avon engines of his Lightning.
This new aeroplane was, despite its difficulties, despite its management problems, despite the rather unpleasant and hazardous faults that had occurred in some of the first few flights, it was now showing itself to be a tremendous thoroughbred. It was going to be a wonderful aeroplane. It was already extraordinarily satisfying to fly as a professional. I had been looking forward enormously to shaking the dust of Boscombe off my feet, figuratively, and flying this aeroplane back to my own base, where even the voice of the air traffic controllers were my friend. And we flew back into that environment, we brought it home, and now we were going to get on with it, and no holds barred. A very good feeling.
"17 aircraft that formed the development batch were in varying states of readiness at the factories. The second prototype, XR-220, was at Boscombe Down and programmed for its first flight on the 6th of April 1965. But the gathering momentum of opinion against the project had become unstoppable.
I can't be sure when the decision was taken in Cabinet, but the decision was taken in the relevant Cabinet committee on the same occasion as we decided to cancel the P1154 and the transport aircraft. But Wilson was very frightened because there was much more public interest in the TSR-2 than the other aircraft to put it in the same package. So he asked us to delay it until the budget in April. And that's when the formal decision was taken and announced.
He called the contractors at midday to the ministry on the day in which cancellation was to be announced in the budget debate, and he told them that it was going to be cancelled. So immediately they did what any reasonable person would. They requested permission to ring up their workforce, to ring up their factories, and to warn everybody themselves, rather than allow them to learn about this frightful blow in their lives over the radio or the newspaper. And Roy Jenkins refused. He said it was a budget secret.
Quite extraordinary. And we never got a satisfactory explanation of why it was done that way. And I still don't understand why it was done that way, because it was an insult to the House to make an announcement in that particular form where there was no possibility of questioning at all.
Oh, it was just a feeling of inevitability. We'd been struggling. We'd put every possible effort, and when I say we, I mean the whole workforce, all the engineers, the ground staff, the aircrew, of course, the flight developers, the airworthiness people, administrators backing it all up, had been working on an all-hours basis. There was no knock-off time. You worked on through the night. Leave was cancelled. Family arrangements were disrupted. Tensions developed in families because husbands were overworked, overstressed. This had been going on for years.
Well, I think there was a tremendous feeling of letdown initially. It was a terrible disappointment to a lot of people who were thoroughly committed to the project, which was just beginning to fly and literally taking off.
Everybody who was concerned with the efficiency of the Air Force thought that the TSR-2 would be too late in service to meet the Air Force's needs. That was the first thing. Secondly, its cost had tripled in the 4 years before I got in. Its time of delivery had extended by 3 years, and there was no guarantee they'd have kept to the cost and timing as I was given it.
Well, I think the nail in the coffin, the sort of trigger reason, was when the Australians refused to buy it and opted for the American plane at the beginning of 1964.
In order not to waste all the knowledge and the potential knowledge to be gained from these things, and also, of course, with an eye on trying to keep people in employment, not only in our factories, but in the component factories, the suppliers, We put forward a program to the ministry within 2 weeks of cancellation, proposing that the two prototypes should be kept on, I think, a 100-hour test and development program for research into the future Concorde test program, because they're very similar types of aeroplane. Much valuable information could be gained, and I think we put it forward on the basis of a fixed price contract. We were asking for £1.5 million to do 100 hours of concentrated research.
Roy Jenkins said that means it must cost at least £2 million, and in my experience you've got to double that, and that means £4 million, and that's too much. So there was a complete shock.
Following the cancellation came one of the most bizarre episodes in the history of British aviation. For some, it appeared that the cancellation of TSR-2 was not enough. Orders were given to destroy everything.
The massive publicity was given, obviously with official blessing, to operatives in our factories who had actually built these airframes, dragging them out onto the tarmac, shoving oily rags in them and setting fire to them, particularly to the magnesium areas, which burnt like a holocaust.
I think it's the most shameful aspect of this sad story. There is no sort of reason whatsoever except what you could really describe as a selfish determination to ensure that that aeroplane would never be built under any other circumstances or in the future. I never heard anybody connected with this project who was other than shocked by this decision. I can't tell you who took it, but the finger must point at the government in one department or other.
Well, it wasn't ordered by me, I can tell you that. Absolutely not. And I don't think it was ordered by Roy Jenkins, who was the only other minister who would have had a say.
I know then that I just had the immense dramatic task of inviting some hundreds of my staff to consider the fact that they were going to be made redundant. And all these dedicated people of high skills were just shown their cards, and many of them went to America, of course.
In America, in 1964, the F-111 was taking shape. Following meetings with Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, Dennis Healy had become convinced that the F-111 would fulfill the RAF's requirements, whilst being cheaper and in service earlier than TSR-2. Events would prove him wrong, as this project also ran into problems of delay and spiralling costs, a fact that the Australians would later come to pay dearly for. Whilst Dennis Healy was talking to McNamara, Prime Minister Wilson was meeting President Johnson to discuss a number of areas of mutual interest. Wilson wanted US backing for the pending loan from the IMF. The thinking back in Britain was that the Americans had extracted a heavy price for their support by demanding the cancellation of TSR-2.
I don't think international diplomacy operates quite so crudely as that. We wanted good relations with the Americans, but there was never any suggestion in my mind that a condition for having IMF support. The Americans wanted a variety of things. They wanted to sustain sterling as a sort of auxiliary currency to the dollar.
The IMF had already decided a week earlier to give us the loan we needed, and we got the necessary loan from other governments as well. So that didn't enter into the discussions in any way.
They wanted us to maintain East of Suez Rail, as it were, to share a world rail with us. And they were quite keen to, not specifically that we should cancel the TSR-2, but they would like us to buy the F-111, for exactly the same reason that we would like the Australians to buy the TSR-2.
Britain did order the F-111, but ironically, the deal would later fall victim to exactly the same problems that plagued TSR-2. In the interim, the RAF found themselves having to deal with the gap that TSR-2's cancellation had caused.
What we had to do when it was removed from the program was to start innovating, improvising, and making good the shortfall. And that's something which the Royal Air Force historically has always been extremely good at. And of course what we did was to plan and reprogram and retrain the V-Force so that it could go low level for part of its attacks. That was one of the moves that we put on the board in order to make good the deficiency of the TSR-2. Well, I think TSR-2 is probably an example, and it's wrong to lay down the law on the matter when when you don't know all the facts and haven't got access to all the books and records. But I think it is an example, and we've seen far too many of them before and since, and even to this day, of British governments not seeming to value the importance of a thriving aerospace industry.
I think what was the case was that that I and some other people too, Chancellor Jim Callaghan, George Brown, who was First Secretary of State, thought, and I think thought with some justification, that the aircraft industry was consuming too large a proportion of our research and development resources, and also that it was too keen, for understandable reasons, not unworthy reasons, it was too keen on breaching the frontiers of knowledge on aircraft design, rather than concentrating on making and selling planes which it could make and sell.
Well, nobody, it's 30 years now, and nobody has ever in that time given me a clear and reasonable explanation of why it was cancelled.
I called my book The Murder of TSR-2, and that, I believe, is exactly what happened. Though to put your finger precisely on the murderer is less easy. There were a good many.
It was August the 17th, 1966, when the fuselage arrived. Previously to that, 2 or 3 days before that, we'd had a couple of TSR wings arrived here at Shoeburyness, White City. They all came in bit by bit, and we then proceeded to build it up until the state that it is on that picture behind me on our apron. It was quite a showpiece. It was a beautiful aircraft. It was way ahead of its time, so we was informed. And I personally think it was a criminal act to get rid of it as it was done. But it was our job in them days to destruct, to test the vulnerability of fuselages, systems, wings, anything like that. That is our job. Unfortunately, the TSR was one of them. And when she finally met her death here, there were several of us that was very, very sad. And we remember very well to this day. We have got 1 or 2 little bits and pieces of her still remaining, but nothing of any size or bulk. The only one that flew, she was destroyed, which I feel very sad about.
In the end, TSR-2 fell victim to the many factors that conspired against it. Politics, both national and international, inter-service rivalry, and an unwieldy management structure, all ensured that delays and escalating costs became inevitable. If the cancellation of the project was the result of a callous political decision, then TSR-2 was also a victim of its own ambition.
I think it was a bridge too far. I think it was a very ambitious, expensive, and at the same time extremely capable military aeroplane, which was perhaps too far advanced for our Air Force and our Ministry of Procurement to cope with. The concept was probably too great for them. They hadn't grown up. They should have done. You know, it's all been done since. And we'd gone a long way to doing it then. But this was actually fundamentally lack of faith in the ability of our aircraft industry to produce those sort of goods. We were, in fact, leading the world at the time, but the actions of the politicians made sure we would never do it again.